you read through chapters 12 through to 25, take note of the timestamps. It gives you the chronology of Abraham's age to show how things are developing as he's getting older. Now, it is important here that it is God who makes this promise and this covenant, the introduction to this covenant. There is not yet a promise for Christ or a promise of Christ. Often when we think of the Abrahamic covenant, they think of it in terms of its totality, saying, well, there you go, God made this promise to Abraham, and it is spiritualized because it's fulfilled in Christ. Christ is not mentioned here. He's not included in the promise at this stage. And so what you have is God saying, here's a covenant that I'm going to make with you. And it revolves around the land. That is important. Now look at verse 6. Abraham passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said to him, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Again, no condition, but the reaffirmation is not the fact that he will be a blessing and that the nations of this world will be blessed in him, but the land. The very first thing God emphasizes in this introduction to the covenant is, I am going to give you land, and your generations, your seed, your offspring will occupy this land. Now, this word offspring is where the confusion comes in. Offspring can mean a multiplicity of people, such as a nation that will come from Abraham. All of these people are called the offspring of Abraham. But offspring can also mean a singular person. At this stage, what God is saying, to your offspring I will give this land. That is everyone that will come from you. The nation of Israel that will come from you. This land will be theirs. What you have next, let me just put my phone on silent. What you have next is a testing of Abraham's faith with regard to the land and the offspring. Look at chapter 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abraham went down to Egypt to sojourn there. Now, it's not a sin for him to leave the land. It wasn't wrong for him to leave the land. There was a famine in the land. But what did God promise him? The land. And so a famine came. What happened? He left the land. Abraham is not at the stage where his faith is fully refined yet. So God is giving him opportunity to demonstrate his faith. And so Abraham leaves. What happens as he leaves? His wife, Sarai, at this moment, is taken captive by Pharaoh. And notice in verse 15, and the princes of Pharaoh saw her, and they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Remember God's promise to him, I'm going to give you a land and I'm going to give you an offspring. So now God has to establish to Abram that the land, even though there's a famine there, will eventually be yours. And regardless of how it looks, you're going to get it. And secondly, the seed will come from your wife. And so in this testing, God protects Sarai from Abram's foolishness. God protects her. Notice what it says in verse 17. And Yahweh afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So Pharaoh called Abraham and Pharaoh called Abraham and said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Where did he get that from? It was God who revealed it to him. You are taking another man's wife. Even in the pagan world, it was wrong to take another man's wife. God reveals this to him, and he realizes, I can't have this woman as my wife, and so he sends her back to Abraham. Abraham, thinking that he's wise in saying to his wife, tell them, when they see you, you are my sister. Now, technically true, but it's a half lie. She's not his sister, she's his half sister. But at this stage, she is his wife. So he's lying to protect himself. And God, despite this mistake, despite this error in judgment, protects Abraham's seed by protecting Sarai. In chapter 13, the land comes up again. God refines Abraham's faith a little bit more. Look at verse 1. So Abraham went from Egypt, he and his wife. Now, it doesn't say that the famine was gone. It is presumed that the famine is gone, but it's not mentioned. And often it will tell you that things have changed. Old Testament is very good at telling you that there's a change in direction or change in things. Doesn't seem that way. But Abraham at this stage realizes, I can't be in Egypt. So he goes back with his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. And this is the area towards Canaan. Now, Abraham was very rich in livestock. I'm going to read the whole section. I'm not going to read the whole section because most of you should know this story. But look at verse 4. And he's making his way to the place where he had made an altar. That's where God made the promise to him first, at the first. And there Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. It's the first time that you have that phrase about Abraham. This is the first time Abraham's faith is demonstrated in calling upon the name of Yahweh. Abraham's trust is being established in God. Now, what happens in this section? Lot and Abraham's families have a collision. They have a problem because there's a debate as to who's occupying what land and whose herdsman is taking care of whose livestock. And at this stage, they have to part. Now, look at the end of verse 7. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Why do you think that is there? To remind you that the land is occupied by these foreigners, and God has allocated their land to Israel, to Abraham. So regardless of the fact that they are occupying it, God says, it's not your land. I created it. It's my land. And I will give it to whom I determine. And so God makes sure that the reader understands that there's a reminder here that it's not yet been occupied by Israel or by Abraham. Then Abraham said to Lot, verse 8, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen and your kinsmen. Is not, for we are kinsmen, is not the whole land before you? Now, often we don't really see this because Abraham, it looks like he's tossing the dice. But what Abraham is doing is he's putting his trust in God. He's saying, Lot, the land is before you, but I trust my God to provide me the land that you don't choose. So you choose. Separate from me, and if you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, I will go to the left. Again, remember, Lot knows, as well as Abraham does, that the Canaanites and the Perizzites are in the land. And so Lot chooses for himself the better looking area. Notice in verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus, they separated from each other, and Abraham settled in the land of Canaan. Well, God promised you the land, and now you are settling in the land. Why is that significant? Because this is what God wants Abraham to do, is to trust in him, to believe in him. And so Abraham doesn't choose the land, he's given the land by default, but it's a demonstration of his reliance on God. And so he settles in that land, despite the fact that there were wicked Canaanites and Perizzites. The second element of this covenant is revealed in verse 14 through to 18. Now Yahweh said to Abraham, after Lot had separated from him, and that's a significant statement because now the burden of Lot has been removed and God deals with him because he's decided to stay in the land that God has actually given him. Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and eastward, southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give. I will give to you and to your offspring forever. Offspring here is your generations of generations, your people, your kind, those who will come from you. That's the idea of offspring here. I will make your offspring, again, the people that will come from you, as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. What does God emphasize here? The two things that was just tested, land and seed. I'm promising you, Abraham, that I'm going to give you this land as far as your eye can see. This land will be yours. And then the offspring, though you have not got a child yet, your offspring again is people plural. Though you don't have a child yet, this offspring will fill this land. Verse 18. So Abraham moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to Yahweh. Second mention of the altar. And it always follows God's reaffirmation of the promise. Abraham is starting to realize, hang on, if God is making this promise and he's moving me in this direction, if he's preserving me in so many ways, then he will fulfill it. This is a development of Abraham's faith. Again, there is no Christ mentioned at this stage. It is still just the land and the offspring in totality. Why am I emphasizing that? Because later on in the New Testament, in Galatians chapter 3, Paul says it's not the offspring as in plural, but offspring as in singular. And that is used to say that we need to reinterpret the Old Testament, that this offspring here means Christ, but it's not so. There's one specific passage where Christ is mentioned, and it's not yet found here. And then the story moves on. I'm not going to go through all the sections, but jump to chapter 15. You have another reaffirmation of the covenant. This is the third affirmation of the covenant. And here God adds the idea of a child. It was first just offspring as a nation, as a group of people, but here God limits it to, look, I'm going to give you a child. Verse 1. After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abraham in a vision. Fear not, Abraham, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abraham said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abraham said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and here offspring relates to a singular person, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. God does not use the word offspring yet, but here deals with how Abraham understands offspring in terms of a singular child. And God says, this man will not be your son, but you will have a child. That is a new element to the covenant. So God is expanding the covenant. Look, I promised you a nation, and now I'm going to tell you how this nation will come into existence by your own son. Verse 5, and he brought him outside and said to him, look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. What is offspring there? People. The peoples of your people. And he believed Yahweh, and he counted it to him as righteousness. You see the he counted? You can make that a capital H. Generally, I write capital H when it refers to God, and it helps when you see that God counted his faith to Abraham as righteousness. So there's a development of Abraham's faith. He believed, and at this stage, God counts it as righteousness. There's a development in how Abraham believes, in what Abraham believes, and how he responds to God. He didn't believe so much the promise of the land because he left the land. He didn't believe so much about the promise of the seed because he made his wife available. But at this stage, Abraham is full on in believing what God has promised him. And there's a change or a shift in how God develops the promise from this time forward. Verse 12, then the sun was going down and a deep sleep fell on Abraham. And behold, dreadful, or literally terror and great darkness fell upon him. When we speak about the fear of God, we often think in terms of reverential fear, and that is right. There is an element of reverential fear, but there's also an element of terror, of being afraid of God. And that's what Abraham's experiencing here. He's in great fear of God, great terror falls upon him. And Yahweh said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners. What is the offspring there? People, the people of your people. And that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there. And they will be afflicted for 400 years, and I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. God is promising that Israel is going to go into captivity for 400 years. We have the Exodus being prophesied by God in this section. Again, it's a reaffirmation of the promise that God will fulfill his promise to him, even though the offspring will be sojourners, will go into another land. And God is saying to him that doesn't change the fact that I have made this promise to you. Verse 16, and they shall come back in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The timing that will determine their return is when the iniquity of the Amorites are fulfilled, when they are ready to be judged for the iniquity. When the sun had got down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these two pieces. Further up, I didn't read it, but further up, God separates the animals and he passes through it. And in the Old Testament, a covenant was ratified. A covenant was fulfilled by means of cutting an animal in half and then burning it. And as you burn the respective parts, you walk through it. Between the two parts, saying that as these animals have been destroyed and slaughtered, if I break the covenant, so may it be with me. And so God is saying to Abraham, by this very covenant that I am demonstrating to you, I will not break it. On that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abraham. I've said it to you previously. Up to this stage, it was the introduction to the covenant. Various aspects of the covenant have been introduced, and at this stage is where God ratifies the covenant, and he says, this will never be unfulfilled. Saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of Euphrates, the land of the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Rephaim, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. In other words, all the land that I have determined will be yours. I don't know about you, but every time this covenant is reaffirmed, what does God always mention first? The land. Because it's significant to the nation of Israel. God is developing their identity. The first element of the identity is the faith of Abram. The second element of the identity is the land. They have the faith of Abram. If they have the land, they are God's people. So, any questions or comments as we move on? There's a question.
Just on the covenant that was just made in chapter 15.
Yeah.
are we essentially saying that when God made this covenant, that he was putting his own eternity in jeopardy because
Is what?
his own eternity attribute of, he's eternal? Because if he doesn't fulfill this covenant, which we
If
know
he
he
doesn't
wouldn't,
fulfill the covenant,
yeah.
then what's the
So
implication of that? Yeah, he
God will
has to
die
be.
then? Is
Yeah.
that it's quite a big,
So the answer
yeah.
to your question, is he putting his own eternity into jeopardy? Is no. Why? Because he will fulfill it. So God's promise to Abraham, even though it's a very harsh demonstration of the seriousness of the covenant, meaning that if I don't fulfill it, then as these um, elements have been ripped apart, so should it happen to me. Yeah, God is putting himself on the block. He's putting his head on the block and saying, "Yeah, I will fulfill it." So it will never not happen. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, seeing that it is a unilateral covenant, can you maybe just touch or explain on the conditional, unconditional aspects of the covenant and its far-reaching ecclesiological, eschatological implications
Of this covenant?
of this covenant? So what I'm saying is it's a unilateral covenant, but some would argue it is, so if it's unilateral, it's unconditional. Some will argue that it's conditional, which we know it's not. It's an unconditional covenant because God alone walked
Yeah.
through the animals.
Yeah,
But is there perhaps a conditional aspect to the covenant?
to the covenant?
Yeah, so in terms of, for example, to benefit from the blessings of the covenant, there's an aspect of obedience, which some will then argue, see, there's the conditional, but that is not the essence of the covenant, is the blessings of the covenant, perhaps.
Okay, so the blessings of the covenant relates to actually the Mosaic covenant.
Yes, so where it flows out.
Yeah, not the Abrahamic covenant. What is the blessing of the covenant here? The land,
Yes.
the offspring. It's made to Abraham and about what God would do for him. There is nothing he has to do other than have a child, but there is nothing that he has to do in order for him for this covenant to be fulfilled. What does
Yeah.
Abraham have to do to get the land?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Even though he left the land, even though they will be out of the land, God will still fulfill the promise to him. Are there requirements for this covenant? The same with the Noahic covenant. It's a unilateral covenant that God alone will fulfill by himself. So there's nothing that God requires of mankind in order for this covenant to be fulfilled. Now, with the Mosaic covenant, it does relate to the land. And the obedience, disobedience in that section is if they are disobedient, they will not remain in the land, but the land as a promise of God will still be theirs, even though they will be shunned from the land for a short period of time.
Yes. So precisely. So because of the conditional aspects of the Mosaic covenant doesn't nullify
Does not, yeah.
the unconditional aspect of the Abrahamic covenant.
Abrahamic
That's a
covenant.
clarity. But my question, so pertaining to that, what is the far-reaching ecclesiological, eschatological implications
For what now?
for the unconditional nature of the Abrahamic covenant?
Okay, so there's, I think you are referring to Galatians chapter 3, where it speaks about the seed being Christ, the offspring being Christ. The far-reaching implications is that God still has a promise to fulfill to Abraham. Abraham's people are under judgment at the moment, which is Israel, but the totality of the land has not been given to them yet. There are still aspects of the land that they have not occupied, and when you get to Judges, you see that. Actually, it starts in Joshua, but in Judges more so, that they start to live with the people of the land, and they don't actually chase them out, and so they only get up to Dan, which is what is the former name of Dan? Not Beersheba. I forget the name now. Anyway, so they only get up to that area, and they don't actually get rid of all the Canaanites in the land, which causes problems. Secondly, the church is not in view here. The church will be blessed by Abraham or through Abraham, but the church is not the one that occupies the land. I've heard people say that we need to occupy the land, and that God has given us the land. What land? I mean, I don't know what land God has given to me. I would love to have a piece of that land, but there's no land promised to me. The land is promised to Israel. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay, is it on? Yeah. So I just want to continue walking through the eschatological door that Shanthan's opened. So the land is promised, and it's clear that this land is promised, and that promise will be fulfilled. And we know that in the millennial reign of Christ, Israel will be in that land, and they will occupy the land as has been promised.
Yep.
The question we then want to also ask is, will that land be occupied in that way when there is a new earth? Revelation chapter 20. So does that kind of change that, or is that carrying right into that new heaven or the new earth specifically as far as the land is concerned?
Yeah, that's a eschatological
Conundrum.
question. So there's two views: the renewed earth or the brand new earth. So the renewed earth would say that the land promise still remains, and that Israel gets their land, and the rest of the redeemed get to live on the rest of the land. There's the new heaven and new earth view, the new creation model view, which says it's a brand new earth and a brand new heavens, which means that the land distinctions are no longer existing because it's not Israel anymore, it's now a new land. And in that sense, there is no more distinction between Israel and the Jews. So that is an eschatological discussion, which I'm not going to have over here because it's a long, it's a long discussion. But those are the two prominent views. Where do I land? I'm more of the Reformed renewal perspective than the brand new earth perspective. And I do think that the new heavens and the new earth is God renewing this land, this earth, rather than destroying it completely. I know that there are challenges with that because the heavens get destroyed, and so, I mean, the sun and the moon gets destroyed. So, yeah, there are challenges with both views, but I think that's a safer one. So, anyway, let me move on. Chapter 16. Why does this chapter? Why is it in the Bible? Because clearly it puts Sarai in a bad light, and it puts Abraham in a bad light. Look at verse 2. And Sarai said to Abraham, "Behold, now Yahweh has prevented me from bearing children. That is true. Go into my servant. That is not good. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." No, that's not what God said to Abraham. It will be your seed. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. If you have a highlighter, you should highlight that. Why? It's exactly the same words that appears where? Genesis chapter 3, verse 17. Let me put it this way. It is never good when you are listening to the voice of your wife. No, I'm just joking. The interesting thing in Genesis chapter 3:17 is Adam is worth her. She doesn't have to convince him of what she's taken, where the fruit came from, what it's going to do. He just takes and he eats. So when the wife makes a decision for sin and you listen to the voice of your wife, it is never good. The same year, she makes a decision that is sinful and puts the line that God has promised Abraham in jeopardy. She does that, and he complies. He says yes. Now notice the mess that comes from this. There's another guy. His name is Ishmael, and his hand will always come or be against Isaac, the promised seed. Verse 5. Look what happens. Now, Abraham takes Hagar and produces a child, or she conceived. Notice what happens in verse 5. And Sarah said to Abraham, "May the wrong done to me be on you." Oh my goodness, woman. You just gave him your what do you call him? Slave, servant. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. No, No, you looked on her with contempt because you see later on that she actually is the one that is in contempt or hates this woman. Very strange interaction here. Again, God protects Abraham. He provides a child here, verse 11. And the angel of Yahweh said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant, and shall be a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has listened to your affliction." And so Hagar bears a child named Ishmael. Chapter 17. When Abraham was 99 years old, Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, "I am Yahweh, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may take my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly." In other words, let me fulfill my covenant to you. And Abraham fell on his face, and God said to him, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude," that is offspring of nations. "No longer shall your name be called Abraham, but your name shall be Abraham." And this is where the major change in the covenant is starting to take place. Notice what God says in verse 7: "And I will establish my covenant between me and your offspring." That is not singular, that is still the people, your generations. "And after you, their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offsprings after you." The fact that God says an everlasting covenant means that it is an everlasting covenant. And he repeats it again, verse 8: "And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojourning and the land of Canaan for an" what? Everlasting possession. And that's why I hold to the renewed earth view, because it's everlasting. "And I will be their God." And then God gives the sign of the covenant. Interestingly, God reaffirms both the promise of offspring and the land as the substance of this covenant. Chapter 18, Isaac is born in the middle of chapter 17, and again, God reaffirms it in verse 19 that it's an everlasting covenant, and the offspring relates to the nation and not to a single person, not yet. But then, if you get to chapter see if I can find it. Oh, it is in chapter 17. Sorry, I missed it. No, it's not. Chapter 22. That's where I wanted to go. Go over to chapter 22. We'll end on this. There are shorter, more succinct reaffirmations of the covenant, but this is one of the largest ones thus far. And it's significant on a number of fronts. We have the almost sacrifice of Isaac. Often Isaac is seen as a type of Christ, but who is actually the type? It's the goat or the ram. That's the type. It's sacrificed in place of Isaac, not Isaac. Isaac's not sacrificed. If anything, Abraham is the one that is considered to be a type, who is like God, who offers up his only son, or willing to offer up his only son. But nevertheless, notice the reaffirmation of the covenant here. This is the first time you will see the promise to the seed singular. Verse 14. "So Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Provides, and it is said to this day on the mount that Yahweh, it shall be provided." And I believe it's the same mount that the Temple Mount is established on. That is where the almost sacrifice of Isaac took place. But take note from 16 onwards. "And the angel of the Lord," now speaking on behalf of God, and you will notice that he sometimes switches between God and the angel of the Lord. "The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself, now speaking as God, I have sworn, declares Yahweh, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring, that is the nation, as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Did you get this, the shift there? So in the former, in verse 17, your offspring shall be as the stars, that is the nation of Israel. But then in the second part, your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, is Christ. This is the first time the mention of Christ is included, or the promise of Christ as the one through whom the nations will be blessed. That is the promise of Christ in the Abrahamic covenant. It is not the spiritualizing of the land, it is not the spiritualizing of the people, but it's the fact that the promise of the blessing of the nations will come through this one, through Christ. Why? Because you have obeyed my voice. Abraham's faith has come full circle. He's been refined in his faith. He has demonstrated that he trusted God, and slowly, progressively, over about 25 years, 15 to 25 years, Abraham's faith is now refined, willing to do whatever God asks, even the ridiculous request of killing his own son. Abraham says, I will do it. Whatever you ask, I will do, because I am sure you will fulfill your promise. Chapters 12 through to 25 speaks about Abraham's refining of his faith in terms of how God's promise is developed, his covenant is developed with Abraham. I'm going to end there. The discussion shifts after this, so I'm gonna end over there. Any questions or comments in our last few minutes? What now?
The name of Dan was Laish.
Lachish. Laish or Lachish, yeah. Yeah, that's a place. Did you Google it? Go ahead. Over here.
Thanks, Denver. If you can just comment quickly, what do you think the reason is that the New Testament speaks so favorably about Abraham and Sarah? Because all mentions of them are incredibly positive about their faith.
Yeah.
But in the Genesis account, we see a lot of failing and stumbling.
Yeah, similar to believers today, there's a lot of ups and downs, and you can see that in Abraham's life. Same with Sarah, same with her. But despite their failures, God still views them as being exemplary in their faith, because their faith develops over time, and as time goes on, the deeper their faith gets. And so the finality, when they eventually pass off the scene, they are both man and woman, Abraham and Sarah, are both characters of faith. And so I think we can learn from that. Our faith should be progressing over time. And it shouldn't be the same like when you got saved the first time, but actually we should be further along the older we get. Does that answer? Okay. Anything else? Anything on your reading thus far? Anything that's been interesting that you want to share?
So my question is, why does it seem like the fulfillment of the God's promises is dependent on the obedience, Abraham's obedience?
Oh, because it says, because you have obeyed my
Yes.
voice in verse 18. Let me think about your question. Why does it seem like the covenant, did you say the covenant, fulfillment of the covenant was dependent upon Abraham's obedience? No, I don't think it was. I think God is making an affirmation of the fact that he was willing to sacrifice his son. God has already fulfilled the promise. the covenant is already fulfilled, other than the land promise. At this stage, the seed promise is fulfilled. And the voice here relates to God asking him to sacrifice his son. So it doesn't relate directly to the covenant, but the fact that he was demonstrating obedience actually was demonstrating mature faith at this stage. So not the covenant. Good question. Anything else? All right, let's take a short break and then we'll continue with our preaching service.